In the chaos of combat during World War II, soldiers faced many fears: enemy fire, artillery bombardment, tank attacks, and the ever-present possibility of death or injury. But one fear that plagued soldiers of most armies was the terrifying prospect of running out of ammunition in the middle of a firefight. For German, Japanese, and Soviet infantrymen, ammunition shortages were a constant concern. Yet American soldiers operated with a confidence that their enemies found baffling. They knew that ammunition would keep flowing to them, almost no matter what. This wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the result of the most sophisticated military logistics system ever created. Today we're going to explore why American infantry rarely ran out of ammunition during World War II, and how this advantage helped win the war. The story begins not on the battlefields of Europe or the Pacific, but in the factories and planning offices of the United States in the years before and during the war. When America entered World War II in December 1941, it possessed something that no other combatant nation could match: an enormous, undamaged industrial capacity protected by two oceans. American factories were safe from enemy bombing, unlike those in Germany, Britain, Japan, or the Soviet Union. This meant that once American industry converted to wartime production, it could operate at maximum efficiency without interruption. The numbers are staggering. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced approximately 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. That's billion with a B. To put this in perspective, this was enough ammunition to supply every American serviceman with roughly 5,000 rounds each, though of course the distribution was far from equal, with combat infantry receiving the lion's share. But simply producing ammunition was only the first step. The real challenge was getting those billions of rounds from factories in places like St. Louis, Denver, and Twin Cities to soldiers fighting in places like Normandy, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines. This required a logistics system of unprecedented scale and sophistication. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department was responsible for this Herculean task, and it approached the problem with typical American emphasis on organization, standardization, and overwhelming resources. The journey of a single bullet from factory to foxhole involved dozens of steps, multiple forms of transportation, and the coordination of thousands of personnel. Ammunition would leave the factory by rail, be transported to coastal ports, loaded onto cargo ships shipped across either the Atlantic or Pacific, unloaded at forward bases, sorted into unit allocations, transported again to supply dumps closer to the front, and finally delivered to the actual soldiers who would fire it. The U.S. military developed a system called the supply pipeline that treated ammunition like water flowing through pipes. The goal was to maintain continuous flow, with ammunition constantly moving forward to replace what was being consumed at the front. This required careful calculation of consumption rates, which varied enormously depending on the intensity of combat. During major offensives, American units could expend astronomical quantities of ammunition. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, American forces fired millions of rounds in desperate defensive fighting. Yet the supply system, though strained, never completely broke down. Soldiers might occasionally face temporary shortages for a few hours, but catastrophic ammunition failures, where entire units ran completely dry, were extremely rare in the American military compared to other armies. One key innovation was the establishment of ammunition supply points, or ASPs, at various distances from the front lines. These were essentially fortified warehouses where ammunition was stored in large quantities, organized by type and caliber. A typical infantry division might have several ASPs within its area of operations, each holding hundreds of thousands of rounds. Battalion and company supply officers would send trucks back to these ASPs regularly, usually at night to avoid enemy observation, to collect ammunition for their units. The system was designed with redundancy in mind. If one ASP was destroyed by enemy action or couldn't be reached due to combat, there were alternatives. This redundancy was something that German forces, especially later in the war, simply could not match, as their supply lines were constantly under attack from Allied aircraft, and their industrial capacity was being destroyed by strategic bombing. The American emphasis on motorization was another crucial factor. The US Army was the most motorized army in history up to that point. While German infantry divisions relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons for transportation, which were slow, vulnerable, and limited in capacity, American divisions used trucks almost exclusively. The famous GMC CCKW, known as the Jimmy or Deuce and a Half, became the workhorse of American logistics. These 2.5-ton trucks were produced in enormous numbers, over 560,000 during the war, and they could navigate difficult terrain, carry substantial loads, and operate reliably in all weather conditions. A single truck could carry as much ammunition as several horse-drawn wagons, and it could make multiple trips per day where horses would need rest. This meant that American units could be resupplied much more quickly and efficiently than their opponents. Transportation by truck was supplemented by other methods when necessary. In the Pacific Theater, where islands and jungles made conventional transportation difficult, American forces used everything from landing craft to native bearers to get ammunition forward. During the campaign in the Philippines, supplies were sometimes dropped by parachute to units that couldn't be reached by ground. The famous Red Ball Expresses in Europe following the Normandy invasion was a dedicated trucking operation that ran continuously for several months, delivering supplies including ammunition to rapidly advancing units. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved over 6,000 trucks operated by predominantly African American troops, moving 12,500 tons of supplies per day. Without this effort, the advance across France in late 1944 would have stalled much earlier than it did. The organizational structure of American infantry units also contributed to effective ammunition distribution. Each infantry company had dedicated supply personnel whose sole job was managing logistics, including ammunition. At battalion level, there was an entire supply section with officers and enlisted men responsible for ensuring that each company had what it needed. This contrasted with some armies where supply was often an ad hoc afterthought, handled by whoever could be spared from fighting duties. American doctrine emphasized that logistics was just as important as tactics, and trained personnel were assigned to make it work. Squad leaders and platoon sergeants were trained to monitor ammunition consumption and report requirements up the chain of command before shortages became critical. This proactive approach meant problems could often be solved before they became emergencies. The types of ammunition and weapons systems used by American forces also played a role in preventing shortages. The United States achieved a high degree of standardization in its small arms. The primary infantry rifle was the M1 Garand, which fired the .30 MD-06 cartridge. The Browning automatic rifle, or Burr, used the same ammunition. The M1919 machine gun also used .30 MD-06. The M1 carbine used a different cartridge, the .30 carbine, but this was a supplementary weapon. The primary handgun was the M1911 pistol in .45 ACP. This meant that supply officers had to manage only a few different types of small arms ammunition, rather than the bewildering variety that plagued some other armies. German forces, by contrast, used a wider variety of cartridges, and as the war went on and they began capturing and using enemy weapons, their ammunition logistics became increasingly complicated. The amount of ammunition that individual American soldiers carried was also significant. A standard combat load for an M1 Garand rifleman was 80 rounds, carried in 8-round clips in bandoliers and in the soldier's cartridge belt. This was more than what many other armies' infantrymen carried as standard. Additionally, American soldiers were encouraged to carry extra ammunition whenever possible, stuffing extra clips into pockets, packs, or wherever they could find space. Their gunners typically carried 200 to 300 rounds, with other squad members carrying additional magazines to help sustain the automatic rifleman during firefights. Machine gun crews had even larger basic loads, with assistant gunners festooned with belts of ammunition. This meant that even if resupply was delayed, American units started engagements with more ammunition on hand than their opponents. The doctrine of fire superiority was central to American tactical thinking, and it required enormous quantities of ammunition to execute. American infantry tactics emphasized suppressing the enemy with overwhelming volumes of fire rather than carefully aimed shots. The idea was that if you put enough bullets into the general area where the enemy was located, you would kill or pin down opponents while your forces maneuvered. This was very different from the approach taken by armies like the German Wehrmacht, which emphasized marksmanship and fire discipline to conserve ammunition. The American approach required more bullets, but the advantage was that it worked even with soldiers who were not expert marksmen. Given that the US Army expanded from a small peacetime force to millions of men in just a few years, training time was limited, and not every soldier could become a sharpshooter. The doctrine of fire superiority allowed less trained soldiers to be effective by providing them with enough ammunition to saturate targets. Let's look at some specific examples from major campaigns to see how this system worked in practice. During the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944, American forces faced the challenge of getting ammunition from ships offshore to soldiers fighting on the beaches and in the Bocage country beyond. Despite the chaos of the landings, where many supplies were lost or landed in the wrong places, the ammunition supply never completely failed. Within days, organized supply dumps were established on the beaches, and trucks were bringing ammunition forward to the units pushing inland. During the subsequent Battle of Normandy, which lasted until late August 1944, American forces expended millions of rounds of small arms ammunition. The supply system, though tested by the difficult terrain and fierce German resistance, kept pace with consumption. Units engaged in particularly intense fighting, such as those battling through the hedgerows of the Bocage, would sometimes expend their basic loads and require emergency resupply, but the system was responsive enough to meet these demands. In the Pacific theater, the challenges were even greater due to the distances involved and the nature of island warfare. Each island campaign required a massive logistical build-up, with ammunition and other supplies being stockpiled before operations began. During the Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, American Marines faced fanatical Japanese resistance in brutal fighting over every yard of the small volcanic island. The consumption of ammunition was staggering. Marines were firing their weapons almost continuously in some sectors, yet the supply system kept functioning. Landing craft shuttled back and forth from ships offshore, bringing ammunition to the beaches where it was sorted and carried forward by hand, on trucks or on small tracked vehicles through the volcanic sand. Despite the difficult conditions and heavy casualties among supply personnel, ammunition kept flowing to the front lines. By the end of the battle, American forces had expended millions of rounds to secure an island that was just 8 square miles in area. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provides perhaps the most dramatic example of the American ammunition supply system under stress. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, they caught American units off guard and created chaos in the rear areas. Supply lines were cut, depots were overrun or threatened, and the weather prevented aerial resupply for the first week. Bastogne, the vital crossroads town, was surrounded with the 101st Airborne Division and other units trapped inside. These forces were cut off from ground resupply and running low on ammunition as they faced repeated German attacks. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, the supply system adapted. When the weather cleared, aerial resupply operations began, with C-47 transport aircraft dropping ammunition and other supplies by parachute to the defenders. Meanwhile, other American units fighting to contain the German offensive continued to receive regular resupply by truck, even as the situation remained fluid and dangerous. The contrast with German ammunition supply during the same battle is stark. The German offensive relied on captured American fuel and supplies to sustain its momentum, as German logistics were already failing due to Allied air attacks and shortages at home. German ammunition stocks for the offensive were limited, and as the attack stalled, German units increasingly found themselves rationing ammunition. Some German commanders later stated that ammunition shortages were a significant factor in their failure to achieve their objectives. While American units in the Bulge sometimes faced temporary ammunition shortages, German forces faced chronic and worsening supply problems that contributed directly to the failure of their offensive. This comparison illustrates how American logistical superiority translated directly into battlefield advantage. Another factor that helped prevent American ammunition shortages was the establishment of forward ammunition dumps that moved with advancing units. As American forces pushed through France and into Germany in 1944 and 1945, supply units would establish temporary ammunition dumps in captured towns or along roadsides, stocked with the most commonly used types of ammunition. Combat units knew they could find these dumps and resupply quickly without having to send requests far to the rear and wait for delivery. This system required excellent communication and coordination, as supply officers needed to know where dumps were located and what they contained. The U.S. Army developed standardized procedures for marking dumps, reporting locations, and managing inventory that made this system work efficiently. Signs would indicate what types of ammunition were available, how much, and which unit was responsible for the dump. The role of ammunition supply sergeants and ordnance personnel deserves special mention. These men, often unheralded, worked around the clock to keep ammunition flowing forward. They drove trucks through enemy fire, sorted and distributed millions of rounds, kept meticulous records, and solved countless logistical problems. Many were killed or wounded performing their duties. Without their dedication and competence, the entire system would have failed regardless of how much ammunition was produced in factories back home. These supply personnel were trained specialists who understood not just the mechanics of distribution, but also the tactical situation and the urgent needs of combat units. Good supply sergeants developed reputations within their divisions and were valued as highly as good combat leaders, because everyone understood that battles were won or lost based on whether the ammunition kept coming. Ammunition resupply wasn't just about bullets for rifles and machine guns. American infantry units also required grenades, mortar rounds, bazooka rockets, and ammunition for other specialized weapons. The logistics system had to handle all of these simultaneously. Hand grenades were particularly important in close-quarters combat, and American soldiers used them liberally. The standard fragmentation grenade, the Mk2, was produced in enormous quantities and distributed widely. Soldiers would often carry half a dozen or more grenades in addition to their rifle ammunition. Mortar ammunition was bulky and heavy, requiring dedicated carrying parties or vehicles to transport. A single 81 mm mortar round weighed about 10 pounds, and a mortar section could fire dozens of rounds during a single engagement. Keeping mortars supplied required careful planning and dedicated logistics support. The bazooka, the American rocket launcher designed to destroy tanks, was another weapon with unique supply requirements. Each rocket weighed several pounds and came in a protective tube. Bazooka teams needed to be resupplied regularly during intense fighting, especially in areas where German tanks were active. The supply system handled these specialized munitions alongside the more common small arms ammunition, demonstrating its flexibility and sophistication. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German tanks were a major threat, bazooka munition was given priority in resupply operations, and teams were often oversupplied to ensure they would not run out during critical moments. This ability to adjust priorities based on the tactical situation was another strength of the American logistics system. Communication technology also played a role in preventing ammunition shortages. American units were equipped with radio communications down to the company level and sometimes even to platoons. This allowed rapid reporting of ammunition status and urgent resupply requests. A company commander engaged in heavy fighting could radio his battalion headquarters to report that he was running low on machine gun ammunition, and trucks could be dispatched immediately rather than waiting for routine resupply runs. This responsiveness was impossible for armies that relied on messengers or field telephones, which could be cut by artillery fire. The integration of communications and logistics gave American forces a significant edge in maintaining combat effectiveness during sustained operations. Training also played a crucial role. American soldiers were trained in ammunition discipline, not wasting ammunition through poorly aimed fire, but also not hesitating to fire when necessary. They were taught how much ammunition they should have at all times, how to request resupply through proper channels, and what to do if normal supply channels were disrupted. Officers and NCOs were trained to monitor their units' ammunition levels constantly and to take action before shortages became critical. This training created a culture of logistics awareness throughout the army, where everyone from privates to generals understood that supplies, including ammunition, were the foundation of successful operations. This contrasted with some armies where combat soldiers looked down on supply troops and logistics was seen as somehow less important than fighting. The scale of American ammunition production and supply had strategic effects beyond just keeping rifles firing. It allowed American commanders to plan and execute operations that would have been impossible for other armies. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945, for example, involved massive preliminary bombardments and sustained fire support that consumed enormous quantities of ammunition. American commanders knew they could count on resupply and therefore could afford to expend ammunition at rates that would have terrified German or Soviet commanders concerned about their limited stocks. This abundance of ammunition translated into tactical flexibility and operational tempo that enemies could not match. American forces could maintain offensive pressure longer, recover from setbacks more quickly, and generally operate with a confidence born of knowing that their logistical needs would be met. The Pacific Theater presented unique challenges that tested the ammunition supply system in different ways than Europe. Islands had to be supplied entirely by sea, with everything from ammunition to food coming across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese submarines and aircraft threatened supply ships, and typhoons could disrupt operations for days. Despite these challenges, American forces in the Pacific never faced the kind of systematic supply failures that plagued Japanese forces, who were increasingly isolated by American submarines and air attacks. During the Philippines campaign in 1944 to 1945, American forces fighting on Luzon and other islands maintained steady operations for months, supplied by a stream of ships from bases in the rear. Japanese forces, by contrast, were slowly starving and running out of ammunition as their supply lines were severed. This logistical dominance allowed American forces to maintain pressure and eventually wear down Japanese resistance. The role of Navy construction battalions, the famous Seabees, was crucial in the Pacific supply system. These units would land shortly after the initial assault waves and immediately begin building port facilities, roads, and supply dumps. Their ability to rapidly create infrastructure from nothing meant that ammunition and other supplies could begin flowing ashore within days of an island being captured. On Okinawa, for example, Seabees had built substantial port facilities and supply dumps within a week of the initial landings in April 1945, allowing the massive American force on the island to be sustained during the months of brutal fighting that followed. Without this engineering support, the ammunition supply system could not have functioned effectively in the Pacific's island environment. Aerial resupply became increasingly important as the war progressed. The U.S. Army Air Force developed techniques for dropping supplies by parachute with reasonable accuracy. During the Battle of Bastogne, as we mentioned, parachute drops sustained the garrison. Similar operations occurred elsewhere when ground supply routes were cut. In the Pacific, supplies were sometimes landed on beaches or dropped inland to units fighting in difficult jungle terrain. The C-47 transport aircraft became famous for its reliability in supply operations, able to land on rough airstrips or drop supplies from low altitude. The coordination required between air and ground forces for these operations was complex, but the U.S. military developed procedures that made them routine. The quality control and safety procedures around ammunition handling also contributed to the system's effectiveness. American ammunition was manufactured to high standards and packed in weatherproof containers that protected it during shipment and storage. This meant that ammunition remained reliable even after being transported across oceans and exposed to harsh conditions. The military developed strict procedures for handling and storing ammunition to prevent accidents. While explosions at ammunition dumps did occasionally occur, usually due to enemy action or accidents, the overall safety record was good considering the enormous quantities being handled. This reliability meant that soldiers could trust their ammunition to function when needed, unlike some armies where quality control problems led to misfires and malfunctions that could get soldiers killed. The post-war analysis of ammunition consumption provided interesting insights. Studies showed that the average American soldier in combat fired far more rounds per enemy casualty than soldiers from earlier wars. Some estimates suggested thousands of rounds fired for each enemy killed. While this might seem wasteful, it reflected the deliberate American doctrine of fire superiority. The goal was not marksmanship, but suppression, keeping the enemy's heads down while maneuver elements closed for the kill. This doctrine required ammunition abundance, but reduced American casualties by limiting soldiers' exposure to enemy fire. German soldiers, by contrast, were trained to fire less frequently but more accurately to conserve ammunition, but this meant they were more exposed when they did fire. The American approach, while ammunition-intensive, was arguably more effective in preserving friendly forces while achieving tactical objectives. Captured German and Japanese soldiers frequently commented on the seemingly unlimited supplies available to American forces. German soldiers called artillery fire the American Artillery Orchestra, noting how American guns fired continuously with no apparent concern for ammunition consumption. Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands reported being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire from American weapons. These enemies had experienced chronic shortages in their own forces and were astonished at American abundance. This psychological effect was significant. Enemy forces sometimes lost the will to fight when faced with such overwhelming material superiority. The knowledge that Americans would never run out of ammunition while their own supplies dwindled was deeply demoralizing and contributed to eventual defeat. The ammunition supply system was supported by innovations in packaging and transportation. Ammunition was packed in standardized crates and boxes that could be efficiently stacked, transported, and distributed. Color coding and clear labeling made it easy to identify different types of ammunition even in poor light or under stress. Palletization, the practice of loading supplies onto standardized platforms that could be moved by forklift, was developed and refined during World War II, greatly speeding up loading and unloading operations. These may seem like minor details, but they added up to significant improvements in efficiency. A ship loaded with palletized ammunition could be unloaded in hours rather than days, getting supplies ashore and forward to troops much faster. These innovations, developed during the war, became standard practice in military logistics afterward. The integration of civilian industry into military logistics was another American advantage. Private trucking companies, shipping lines, and railroad companies were contracted to move military supplies, bringing private sector efficiency to military operations. These civilian contractors were familiar with moving large quantities of goods efficiently and brought that expertise to the military supply system. The close cooperation between the military and private industry, characteristic of the American war effort, extended to ammunition logistics. Ammunition manufacturers worked closely with the Ordnance Department to ensure production matched military requirements. When new weapons were introduced, ammunition production ramped up quickly. This flexibility and responsiveness was difficult for more centralized, state-controlled economies to match. The financial resources that America devoted to ammunition production and supply were staggering. The United States spent billions of dollars on ammunition alone during the war years. This represented a massive investment, but American leaders understood that ammunition was not an optional expense. It was essential to victory. The willingness to spend whatever was necessary to keep ammunition flowing stood in contrast to Axis powers, who faced resource constraints and had to make difficult choices about allocation. Germany, for example, had to balance ammunition production against aircraft production, tank production, and other competing priorities. The United States, with its enormous economy fully mobilized, could do everything simultaneously. This abundance of resources eliminated the need for the kind of painful trade-offs that plagued German war planning. Looking at the system from the soldier's perspective, the psychological impact of knowing ammunition would be available cannot be overstated. Soldiers who know they will be resupplied fight with greater confidence and aggression. They don't need to conserve ammunition for fear of running out at a critical moment. This allowed American infantry to fight more effectively and contributed to higher morale. Conversely, soldiers from armies with unreliable supply systems fought more cautiously, always aware that they might have to ration their remaining ammunition if resupply failed. This defensive mentality affected tactical decisions and overall combat effectiveness. The American soldier's confidence in his supply system was as much a weapon as his rifle, enabling aggressive tactics that enemies found difficult to counter. In conclusion, the reason American infantry rarely ran out of ammunition during World War II was not a single factor, but the result of a comprehensive system that integrated industrial production, transportation, organization, training, doctrine, and resources into a logistics machine of unprecedented effectiveness. From the factories producing billions of rounds, to the ships and trucks carrying them across oceans and continents, to the supply sergeants distributing them at the front, every element of the system worked together to achieve a single goal, ensuring that American soldiers never had to stop fighting for lack of bullets. This logistical superiority was as important to Allied victory as any battle or strategy. It demonstrated that modern warfare was not just about tactics and courage, but about systems and supply chains. The side that could keep its soldiers fed, equipped, and armed would ultimately prevail, and the United States proved itself the master of this form of warfare. The ammunition supply system was a triumph of planning, organization, and industrial might that gave American forces a decisive advantage and helped win the war. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share.